Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Forgive me if I'm a little bit incoherent. I'll have to use the usual disclaimers about the jet lag. But I'm Kenton Thibaut. I'm the resident fellow for China at the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. And today I'm going to be talking about a frame for understanding Chinese influence, which is known as media convergence. And it's a term that comes from Chinese media scholarship to really capture the comprehensive and integrated way in which China kind of conceptualizes influence and in the information space. So first, this is kind of the outline of the talk. So first we're going to talk about influence and what I talk about as discourse power. It's a sort of narrative agenda setting ability that China believes is necessary for gaining power in the international community. Then I'm going to go into talking about media convergence itself, the frame. And there are three kind of ways to look at this, through channel expansion, content innovation, and then lastly, governance. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what those actually are a little bit later on. Okay, there we go. So first I'll talk a little bit about discourse power, then go into kind of the mechanisms for that describe media convergence. So first, a little bit of level setting. What is even the strategic rationale for states to engage in influence operations? Part of it is to overcome a structural disadvantage. So what that means is they're in a structurally disadvantageous position in the international system as compared to their perceived status. So meaning that they might be a great power, but they perceive their ability to do the things that great powers would do as being stymied by the way that the international system is operated. Another reason to engage in influence operations is to weaken adversaries. It's part of a state toolkit to try to gain the narrative upper hand by weakening adversaries internally and eroding their standing on the international stage. Some key themes in these types of operations are disparaging democracy as a political system, criticizing U.S. hegemony, ranging from cultural to economic to technological, and a rejection of Western values as the universal standard by which all other countries are judged. So China's influence strategy can be thought of in terms of this idea of discourse power. So it's seeking to overcome a structural disadvantage vis-a-vis the United States by gaining this discourse power. The thinking here is that the discourse dominance of the United States has allowed it to structure the international system to its advantage in terms of both values and institutions. And what we mean by discourse dominance is that U.S. norms, U.S. values like Western capitalism and freedom of the press, freedom of speech, these kinds of universal human rights have come to kind of imbue all of these institutions on the international stage. If you think about the World Bank, you think about the IMF, these are organizations that are meant to perpetuate U.S. Economic standards, economic dominance, but also U.S. values. And so the thinking here is that this discourse dominance has allowed the U.S. to structure the system to its advantage and to perpetuate its dominance. And this kind of arrangement is not amenable to China's rise. China's always, for a long time, spoken about discourse power, but recent kind of external pressures have really increased the urgency around this. This perception of the U.S. alliance system seeking to contain it, the international attention around Hong Kong, Xinjiang, South China Sea really beginning and taking up force in 2016. COVID really saw this need to shape global narratives. So this has always been a thing, but really in recent years has come to take on increasing urgency. The idea of discourse power is related to what's known as the comprehensive national security concept. And this idea is that basically under this idea, which was put forward by Xi, pretty much everything has become securitized. At the very center of this idea is the political security of the CCP, which is at kind of the heart of everything. And all of these other domains support this and are kind of organized around the ultimate aim of ensuring the political security of the CCP. And by political security, we mean, legitimacy to rule. And other domains support this, and this includes the idea of information security. And in the Chinese context, information security doesn't just involve things like, the safety of communications or the security of communications. It means how people think, how people talk about what they think, and then how other people talk about China. So this idea is that, in the information context, internal security, so the political security of the CCP, and external security are mutually constitutive. And external security basically means creating the conditions internationally that will allow China to rise in a more, without as many obstacles. So internal security, in terms of the informational aspect, refers to information control. So things like censorship, propaganda, ideological guidance. And then as it relates to external security, like I said, this involves just creating conditions to ensure the international system's amenable to China's priorities. And this is kind of where the discourse power aspect comes in. So this is operationalized in a couple of ways. The idea here is that discourse power involves both the power to speak and the power to be heard. So the power to speak means the ability to articulate a coherent vision for the global order. What is our vision? What is our mission? And then to gain buy-in from key stakeholders. So if you only have a story of what you're offering for global governance, it doesn't mean anything unless people buy into it, people support it. And actually part of the goal of discourse power is to deny the mobilization power of the US and the alliance system against Chinese interests. So when China has a different vision for, say, human rights, that development is sort of the basic human rights, which is meant to kind of stand in contrast to the US line that, individual liberties constitute basic human rights. This is, a way to kind of gain buy-in for countries that are really much more focused on development and development first, as opposed to kind of like a rights-focused approach. So where media convergence fits in. So media convergence represents the acknowledgement of this comprehensive nature of information security and what areas of the information ecosystem need to be leveraged and dominated in order to gain the discourse power China needs to really shift the center of gravity away from the US towards a more China-friendly world order. So here are all these kind of aspects of media convergence. You have internal and external propaganda. You have online and offline dissemination channels, meaning social media, traditional media, and then you have governance. And governance means kind of shared norms and standards and policy practices for how either communication technologies are built or how they're governed. And then you can kind of access them across these three vectors. So you have channel expansion, which is basically trying to expand the number of pathways for Chinese messages to get out in the world. And that can include increasing a presence on social media, increasing your traditional media presence in local environments, et cetera. Content innovation, meaning finding ways for the power to be heard. So crafting more resonant narratives. This can involve really tailoring narratives to specific communities, or hiding pro-government content as kind of neutral news, or engaging in flooding strategies where you have these kind of content sharing agreements with local newspapers where you have a large majority of the information coming from state sources. And then lastly, governance of information systems, as we kind of mentioned earlier. So first is channel expansion, and I want to talk about traditional media here. In terms of China's discourse power strategy, this really refers to expanding lines of communication for disseminating external propaganda, also referred to as international communication. And the aim is really to grow the international audience that is exposed to Chinese narratives and norms, intending to erode the global discourse dominance of the West. And so the report that I'm drawing from, examines efforts at China's channel expansion through the lenses of both traditional and social media. But just to show some of the resourcing behind this, this graph shows some budget figures from 2014 to 2015, which is some of the earliest open source available information on central committee budgets. And the data shows that the Central Propaganda Department received about 2.5 million RMB, or 370 million USD, a 433% increase from the year prior. And the CPD's budget increased substantially compared to either decreased or stable budgets for other central committee organizations and functions. So just here we can see that there is significant resourcing and resourcing as compared to other committees put towards this ideological guidance. Some other stats to talk about traditional media. By 2015, Xinhua had almost doubled its number of overseas branches from 2009. As of January 2021, Xinhua distributed an average of 7,300 articles, photos, videos, and other media content in 15 languages daily. And it's also vastly increased the number of foreign correspondents and hiring of local reporters. Xinhua now has the largest number of foreign correspondents of any news agency in the world. So this is just kind of a snapshot of, what does channel expansion mean in the traditional sense? And we can see that over time, China's really put a lot of efforts resourcing, financial resourcing, human resources behind this. In terms of kind of the social media aspect, just a few kind of stats to illustrate this. China-based Twitter account creation skyrocketed by over 6,000% over a period of about 3 months in 2017. And this was really following reports of the situation in Xinjiang in the Western press. So in August 2017, there were just 761 Chinese language tweets sent from China-based accounts identified in a Twitter data set that we got. And then this number skyrocketed to almost 40,000 in October and 47,000 in November of that year, following increasing international attention on Xinjiang. So the two main languages used by these accounts from 2017 onward were English and simplified Chinese, suggesting the target audience was mainly diaspora Chinese and international users. And on this aspect, we have anecdotal evidence that resourcing on this has expanded pretty significantly as well over the years. Just a couple of examples. Several projects that were identified in government bidding documents include a $320,000 software program that mines Twitter and Facebook data to develop a database of foreign journalists, and a $216,000 program from the Beijing Municipal Police that examines narratives on Hong Kong and Xinjiang on Western platforms. So again, we see evidence of increased resourcing on this, and both traditional and social media. So moving a bit to content innovation. There are different kinds of ways to conduct content innovation. And again, this is how are we going to make the substance of our narratives more resonant with different audiences? And these are some examples of tactics that that scholars have written about to try and engage in this content innovation. One is precise communication. I think probably most people who study this have heard of this. It's about kind of zeroing in on a specific audience and really trying to tailor narratives to what those audience interest sets are. Another one of these is called political native advertising. And basically what this entails is hiding or obscuring state media content as just neutral news items. And one kind of famous example of this is China Daily's China Watch column. Now what this is, it's a monthly publication and it's usually printed in newspapers that have agreements with China Daily to print this. But the problem is that it's just printed as something that's called, China Watch, and there's no indication that it's comes from state media whatsoever in many contexts. So it looks like it's just neutral news reporting, but it's actually you're just receiving ideological guidance from the Central Propaganda Department, which determines the content in these articles. Yeah. Oh, and so just a note on content sharing, just kind of a data point there. Content sharing refers to state media content that is provided for free to newspapers, many of which are in like participants in the Belt and Road Initiative and in media cooperation agreements under the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is where Xinhua or other state media outlets will provide content for free. And just with regards to content sharing, and there was this, just one kind of anecdote. In June 2022 alone, over 80% of China-related articles published by the state-owned Kenya Broadcasting Corporation were sourced directly from Chinese state media. So where people are getting their news about China, and often actually about their own local contexts, we have some studies of newspapers, largely across sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other contexts, that show that a large amount of news that local audiences are getting about their own context come from Chinese state media. So that's problematic in and of itself. So kind of speeding along, the third and final prong of China's approach to media convergence is governance. And this is kind of a loose term, but it really involves ensuring that China-sponsored standards, norms, and governance protocols in prioritized industries are widely adopted. And an example of this is what's called China's flooding the zone strategy in some standard-setting bodies, in which all China-affiliated members, be they from academia, private industry, or government, vote as a bloc to ensure the uptake of a China-sponsored technical standard. So one example of this is Beijing's promotion of the adoption of global 5G standards through the International Telecommunication Union, its subgroup called 3GPP, which the details of which aren't really important. But it's the leading global mobile network standardization organization. Here, China employed its flooding the zone strategy, financing its top telecommunications firm, Huawei, to submit over 19,000 technical contributions and dispatch over 3,000 engineers to participate in the 5G standard setting process. This was compared to the US firm Qualcomm, for example, which had the largest presence of US companies in the subgroup, and made around 6,000 contributions and provided almost 1,300 engineers to attend the subgroup meetings. And according to one analysis, in this subgroup, China supplied about 31.5% of 5G technical standards contributions. And then in July 2020, after the ITU adopted these standards proposed by Huawei, Chinese media broadly celebrated the event as a triumph for China's discourse power. And here is a snapshot of a post on Weibo by the China Academy of Information and Communications Technology, which is under the MIIT, which plays a major role in China's tech standards for areas like 5G, which kind of celebrates this and the strategy behind it and the strategy around getting this passed as kind of a victory for discourse power and gaining discourse power. So here you can kind of see how these different elements come together around the idea of discourse power to try and increase Chinese influence on the world stage as it relates to kind of information and the information ecosystem. So lastly, with regards to governance, these efforts also extend to policy diffusion. We can think of governance in terms of, yes, kind of hard technical standards, but also some of the soft things like norms or policies, ways of governing information and information systems and ecosystems. So here we see a few snippets of different news headlines that kind of highlight how China has been, China's tech diplomacy in terms of trying to really spread some of its norms for how information systems are governed. And as one example here, at an August 2017 roundtable jointly hosted by the government of Tanzania and the CAC, the Cyberspace Administration of China, the Tanzanian Deputy Minister for Transport and Communications endorsed China's web censorship and set it as a model to really strive for. And the quote is, "Our Chinese friends have managed to block social media platforms in their country and replace them with their homegrown sites that are safe, constructive, and popular. We aren't there yet, but while we are still using these platforms, we should guard against their misuse." Later, in 2020, Tanzania developed its electronic and postal communications online content regulations, which included prohibitions on content that causes annoyance. The government amended the regulations in 2022, but made no meaningful changes to really roll back the censorship. So I hope that this has kind of illustrated a little bit this sort of comprehensive way in which China views not just the content that comprises information, but also that information is part of, and information security involves something that's much more comprehensive and integrated in the Chinese context. And then, how it is kind of operationalizing this context externally is through these different mechanisms. So the report is called Chinese Discourse Power, Capabilities, and Impacts. It's part of a series. And this is one that I wrote for the Digital Forensic Research Lab. It goes into a lot more details about this. I was trying to share a few of the data points that we found, but hopefully this was at least somewhat useful, and if not useful, interesting, and if not interesting, then, well, I'm sorry. Thank you. So happy to answer any questions if anyone has them.
Thank you very much. In my personal view, what you present is very interesting.
Thank you.
I'm Julius. I come from Uganda. Uganda is in East Africa. I've seen the East African there newspaper, which is one of my favorite papers.
Mm-hmm.
Just quickly, on where you got that budget information about what the party is spending. It would be a good learning for some of us to know about some of the tactics we could use back home. Thank you.
Why was it 9 years old?
So this information came from from CNKI, rest in peace. But it was one of the latest open source pieces of information that we could find that detailed the budgets for central committees. After that, they really clamped down on putting that stuff out in open source, and it became much more difficult to find. So this was the latest that we could find. Not saying it doesn't exist elsewhere online, but this was the latest that we could find that exists in open source. And just kind of, it was one that illustrated some of the changes mentioned the changes from previous years. So it had 2015, but it also kind of showed the changes from 2014 to 2015, so we thought it was useful as kind of a benchmarking exercise. And we also tried to include, just for kind of like a baseline, here is kind of just like the budget expenditures increase baseline, and then sort of the housing reform expenditures increase, just to show relative to other categories, just how much more resourcing the propaganda department was getting. So yeah, unfortunately that it's old information, but hopefully it captures at least a snapshot in time of, resourcing, which is difficult to find, I find.
Yeah, Alfred, I am based in Senegal, and I saw an example from where I'm based there, where the state is cooperating with Chinese to build this data center with two polarized opinions. At one side, public authorities welcoming this partnership as a model for digital independence, and we, civil society, questioning about the conditions governing this partnership or possible risks for associated human rights, protection of our data, and other matters associated with that. I want to understand from your perspective and experience, what risks you anticipate or see that can be associated with such an investment, and how you take our concerns at civil society and as freedom of expression and digital rights advocates in the country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. First, I'd like to call out the research by a really brilliant scholar. His name is Bulelani Jili, and he's currently at Harvard, and he studies the demand factors in the African context for Chinese tech exports. And his research has really looked into a lot of this. One of the risks that he outlines, and which I'm kind of using as my basis, is that in contexts where privacy standards are non-existent, or governance standards over data are less robust, the things that China provides can be a tool, but in these contexts, the real risk is like the lack of local development of these kinds of like safety and privacy measures. So that's kind of that's the risk there. Is it's less that China is kind of exporting authoritarianism, which is I think a lot of the narrative, and more that in the context where privacy standards are less developed, there is a real risk of the misappropriation of data, exfiltration of data to China. But it's more of I would say it's even more of kind of a local risk of what's being done with this data than kind of the China question. I don't know if that gets to your question, but
I just wanted to know your point of view. It's not like you need to persuade me. I just wanted your point of view. I see you have like same viewers and questions like ourselves regarding these risks.
Yes, my point of view is that when there's a sort of a vacuum of certain standards, then when China kind of appears in a context, China's will kind of try and implement the lowest common denominator standard, which is definitely not one where one that respects individual expression and human rights. And second, I would really invite you to come to the tech transfer workshop that I'm hosting at 4 with Glenn Tiffert. We really want to get civil society opinions on how China's showing up in local contexts. What is your understanding of what tech transfer means? Is that definition appropriate? That is how it's commonly being used in the Western context. So would love for you to join that. Yes.
Briefly, hi, Nate Schenken from Freedom House. Just because you brought up the ITU, my understanding is the current administration in the U.S. has taken a little more focus on some of these governance issues, including at the ITU. Mm-hmm. So just to ask, how do you evaluate those efforts? Do you think they're going far enough? Are they taking them seriously enough? Is there still more room to go on the ITU, but also unrelated, similar?
Yeah, I think the good thing is that I'm speaking about the U.S. When the U.S. focuses on something and marshals resources, we can really get stuff done, and the ITU is a great use case for that. I think now the issue is that so many pieces of what would make a good, not counter strategy, but a good approach to like confronting what China's doing in this space is either siloed in different parts of the bureaucracy which don't talk to each other, or there's different parts of the bureaucracy that I don't know that other initiatives are going on. I'd say that there's the awareness level is really asymmetric, just depending on where you are, and so it's really kind of preventing a coherent response from the U.S. On this. And the reason why that matters is because just how integrated this strategy is, and this approach. I think there's kind of a lack of awareness of just how just the intentionality behind it on China's side, and the different arenas that it's playing in to kind of further this goal.
I just add one thing to that, the kind of a philosophical approach to standard setting in the U.S. and in the West in general, is that it is the purview of industry, not government, to set standards or to decide standards, where that's diametrically opposed to kind of the Chinese view, which is as you explained.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, and I think that brings up China's efforts to really shift a lot of the what were multi-stakeholder mechanisms for governing the open internet into a multilateral kind of forum. So seeing in the UN through like the Global Development Compact, them really trying to shift language away from having a multi-stakeholder system to just government to government, so that it can sort of gain the coalition building power it needs to push its votes in those kind of tech areas. But yeah, thank you for raising that point.
Hi. So in your presentation, you mentioned maybe 5 or 6 different areas, different way that China tried to provide influence to, say, U.S. So my first question is, was there 1 or 2 particular area that have been more effective than other area? And the other follow-up question is, you mentioned about their expenditure changes. From the number you can see, is there any particular area, particular portion that they actually increase more budget?
Yeah, so wait, could you remind me the first question? I have jet lag brain. Just real quick, just one word will remind me.
It's just which, I think you have like 6 or 5.
Right.
Which 1 or maybe or 2 they're more successful, more effective. And
Right.
other, right.
Okay, gotcha. So unfortunately, the areas where China seems to be most successful are the areas that are most difficult empirically to capture, because it's oftentimes sort of the negative outcomes that are really what is the kind of the desired outcome. So what I mean by that is, flooding media environments so negative China narratives can't proliferate. Engaging through United Front organizations to sow doubt in China's bad intentions in XYZ, preventing people from voting on certain matters in the in the UN on certain things that they don't want people to vote on. So a lot of times, self-censorship of journalists who maybe want to go on China trainings and see it as a good career opportunity, or who maybe, intimidated or don't get the resources. So a lot of these areas where China's like successful are kind of negative. So that's difficult to capture empirically. Also, of course, areas where there are, already kind of lower indicators of good governance, usually China's able to make a larger, at least its presence can be larger. So just in terms of the proliferation of its presence, those are kind of some areas we noticed. And your second question was about
The expenditure or effort, maybe one area increased more in 2014.
Right. So definitely the CPD was a standout in terms of the resourcing. We didn't see, other than that was kind of the standout trend. But in terms of other trends with resourcing, one thing we also did call out was that China, I think this was from 2019 to 2020, its sort of outward investment fell everywhere except for in ICT infrastructure, and especially in Africa. It contributes more than like G7 nations and multilateral lending institutions combined. So even when other areas of investment were falling, ICT infrastructure specifically in Africa was going up, and not just holding steady but going up. So gathered together all of these indicators, we try to kind of capture a picture of, okay, this is getting substantial resources financially and personnel wise, and there's an intentionality behind it that is continuing and growing. So that's kind of the best we can do with this kind of stuff, but, work with what we got. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. I really appreciate your attention, and thanks for rolling with me as my brain kind of continues to buffer.